This is part one of the lecture, Post-Revolutionary Mexico and Cardenista Populism. Cardenista refers to Lázaro Cárdenas, who we'll get to in a second. One of the things about Cárdenas is in some ways, he's an incredibly important figure in Mexican history, and in some ways, he may be Latin America's first populist leader. And that's a topic we're going to get into because we're talking about what follows the crisis of the liberal economic order. What does the Depression bring about? And we've talked about that in the cases of, we did Central America with El Salvador, and then certainly Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. But now looking at Mexico, which of course is a little accelerated, was one of the arguments. Its revolution came earlier than the changes of the 1930s. What happens in the 30s? And one of the arguments is that we have an early example of populism. Now, populism is a term that applies to lots and lots of different political configurations all over the world. But in Latin American populism, we're generally talking about something that isn't at all revolutionary. It really does seek a kind of moderate change, mostly incorporating unincorporated groups, previously unincorporated groups, workers, peasants, etc. It's often extremely nationalistic. And you can understand that in the Latin American context of this era, this us versus them. And the us is the downtrodden, ignored popular classes, and the them is the elite that has sold out to international interests. So we're going to get back to populism in the next lecture about Juan Perón, who many people think is the absolutely clearest example of populism. I tend to agree with that. But Cárdenas is an early example of that. Now, who was he? He was an incredibly important figure. We're going to see him pop up at various times, even after he's left the presidency. He's involved a little bit with the Cuban Revolution. His son, who becomes an incredibly popular mayor of Mexico City, plays an important role in national politics in the 1990s. He's probably the single most popular leader in Mexican history. When I lived in Mexico as an undergraduate, my landlady would just weep openly when you would mention his name, that he was just so beloved long after his death. And his great success was that he was able to harness the popular discontent that people felt that the revolution hadn't gone far enough, that it had been betrayed, that the institutionalization of the 1920s hadn't really done much to them, and was able to use that to transform Mexico in the 1930s. He really succeeded wonderfully in institutionalizing the best aspects of the revolution after the presidencies of Álvaro Obregón, who we talked about, and Plutarco Elías Calles, who is in your textbook. It's not that important that you know who he was, but he was kind of a political power broker who puts Cárdenas in power and who Cárdenas basically gets rid of to kind of change the course of Mexico. Well, as I mentioned, there was a political institutionalization that took place in the 20s. And one of the first things that the winners of the revolution, the constitutionalists of Carranza and Obregón, did was they created a new political party in order to bring in the various groups that were looked after in the Constitution. And it was called the National Revolutionary Party, Partido Nacional Revolucionario. And they also created a kind of overarching confederation for all the unions called the CROM, the Confederación Regional Obrera Mexicana. And this was the instrument through which workers did really well after giving their support to the constitutionalists in fighting the popular armies. They got pretty good wage increases and were treated pretty well in the 1920s. Probably among Latin American workers, Mexican workers did the best in the 1920s. But all of that change, and particularly the kind of the 19th century liberal anti-clericalism, I mentioned at the end of the Mexican Revolution lecture, led to things like the Cristero Rebellion. There were people who were put off by these modernizing tendencies. Well, the man who is at the center of today's lecture, Lázaro Cárdenas, and there he is, he lived a 75-year life. He had one term as president in 1934 to 1940, and that he had one term is part of his legacy, that he believed that there should be one term, that you should leave the political scene afterwards, that was how Mexico was going to operate. Now, he had come out of the revolution. At the age of 20, he was already a general in the Constitutionalist Army. He was an incredibly effective leader, not just a military tactician, but a great leader of people and who understood people. And as a reward for his service in the revolution, he was made the governor of his home state of Michoacán. Michoacán was one of the two states involved in the Cristero Rebellion. And in that post, he played a huge role in putting down the rebellion. But he didn't just crush the Cristero rebels militarily. He used violence where necessary in his mind, but he also met with leaders, gave them some of what they wanted. It was a very sophisticated melding of repression and co-optation. And as a reward for this, Calles, who was president, chose him to be the next president, but Calles would remain the power behind the scenes. Cardenas really didn't believe in that. He was very much a sincere Democrat. We're going to get back to that throughout the lecture, that he really believed that kind of the best of what Madero believed in, that democracy, however it worked, whether it worked through this big one-party state that they're putting together, mattered, and that the popular classes should have a say. So when he was picked to run for president, an election that he was destined to win, he was the official nominee, there are no really other candidates, he chose to do something important. He chose to run for the office, even though he didn't have to. He was going to get elected. He campaigned throughout the country, both to give legitimacy to himself as the future president, but also to learn what the local issues were. He met with local leaders. He wanted to hear what was going on. And he really learned what the popular aspirations of Mexico were. And he understood that if he was going to affect change for Mexico City, he needed a lot of buy-in from local political leaders, but even more importantly, from the vast majority of Mexicans. And so he wanted to kind of circumvent the existing political system and find out what people wanted. And this was really just an incredibly brilliant move. And it really paid tremendous dividends when he was in the presidency, because he knew what people wanted, or he thought he did. But he also had contacts in the local level. He could get around the bureaucracy, get around local advisors, and find out what was going on. Once he took office, he continued to do things that had great symbolic value. In office, he adopted the lessons of his campaign. He cut his salary in half. This was the Depression, after all. He wanted people to understand that he was not going to live a comfortable or overly comfortable life at their expense. In fact, he refused to live in the presidential palace, the Chapultepec Palace, which had been built for Maximilian, which Porfirio Diaz had lived in. He wanted very much to be seen as a man of the people. And then he did something really clever. He would just kind of unbeknownst to many people other than his closest aides, he would just get in a car with some of those aides and just show up in a small town or village to inspect what was going on, to talk to local leaders, to continue the back and forth of his campaign. Now, it's a little unfair to use this term because Mexico's its own place, but many people have referred to the Cardenista program as being a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And the argument there is that neither Roosevelt nor Cardenas was a revolutionary. They both were people who thought that capitalism, in order to work well, needed to have some level of state intervention, that the government should humanize the market. What do we mean by that? That it shouldn't leave people at the will of market forces, that there should be some basic protections, a social safety net, some regulations to protect the most vulnerable and also to help the economy overall. And this is very much part of the lesson that he learned fighting in an incredibly bloody revolution and then continuing on with the Cristero Rebellion. He believed that the state at some level should guarantee or make access to social justice available to the people. But he knew that, he's certainly not like a communist in Russia or the rising fascists in Germany or in Italy or in Spain. He understands there's also real limits to state power, that there's got to be a partnership between the market and the state and the popular classes, and that you can't just dictate what's going to go on. So what was his program? He had a 3-point program. He sought to improve the lives, to bring social justice to the vast majority of rural people, people in the agrarian sector, with an agrarian reform, with a redistribution of land. He sought to increase social justice, improve the lives of workers by supporting workers and their unions even more than had been the case in the 1920s. And then continuing on with this idea that we saw with the popular art and the Mexicanidad in the 1920s, he wants to build the state-sponsored education system, the public education system, to really kind of spread the sense of being Mexican throughout the entire country. Now, this was based on what we call a corporatist system. This has nothing to do with corporations. This has to do with a statist system of organizing society, that rather than saying society is organized horizontally, all the poor people in one group, all the middle-class people in another group, all the rich people in another group, instead people are tied into the government through their work categories and also their class. So you would say all the people from the richest to the poorest in agriculture are in one sector. All the people in the industrial sector are in another segment. Think of them as sort of pillars. And Cardenas used the PNR, the party, which he reorganized as the Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, the PRM, as the centerpiece of this. What he said is this party would have 4 components. It would have a group for the peasants, a group for labor, a group for the military, and a catch-all known as the popular group. And the idea was that all labor, industrial labor in different parts of the society would have one segment in the party, and all the peasants in another, and also larger landowners and industrialists also would have their ways of operating. And we're going to get to how this played out in part 2 of the lecture.